Hey, I'm LR Knight, and this is Lionborn Publishing. It's been a few months since I showed off any kind of new book content with our two games, Feet First into Hell and Inheritors, and I'm finally ready to start to show off some of what I'm working on in the massive 2025 refresh of Feet First into Hell. We released the original version of Feet First into Hell in 2023. Since then, we've collected feedback from players, we've done lots more play testing, and we learned a lot of the design process through releasing expansions and releasing our other game, Inheritors. And it's time to revisit Feet First into Hell and really help move it towards that full potential of what this rule set can allow you to do on the battlefield. So instead of trying to change the fundamentals of how the game works, because it's fun, it's fast, it's what we like to play, instead we want to give you more options to be more tactical, to respond to different types of missions and scenarios, and really to put you in the driver's seat of how your drop team plays. And what we're going to look at in this video today is a new feature coming in the new version of the book in 2025 called deployment patterns. So up here on the screen in front of you is the header to the new deployment pattern chapter. The whole book is being redone, by the way. Right now it's at like 95 pages long. Tons of new content, material, lore, unit options, all sorts of new stuff. But in November, I'm going to be trying to show off a couple of key aspects of this new book and hopefully generate a little bit of interest and get people fired up for what I think is a great new version of the game coming out early next year. So, deployment patterns. Well, first of all, why do we need them? In the original version of the game, basically both players will roll a d6, and that tells you more or less where you're going to be deploying on the battlefield. It can be chaotic, it's not really tactical, but it does give you an idea of where you're going to be on the battlefield. And so it was fun, but if it's the only option you ever have, maybe we're missing a step here. So one of the things that we began to talk about as we were designing the new version, which is kind of version 2.0, is that during deployment, your drop team should have options for how you put those guys on the field. And I don't want those options to be tied to a mission. I want chaos on your battlefield because it's more fun that way. And Feet First into Hell is supposed to be fast, fun, and frenetic. So instead of telling you how to deploy, or at least as little as possible, we're going to give you deployment patterns that you can choose based on your team makeup, the briefings, maybe even what your enemy decides, and that will give you more tactical opportunity on the battlefield. So here's the lore. The Drop Corps employ a number of deployment patterns depending on the nature of the battlefield and the briefing. These flexible strategies enable commanders to effectively place forces to leverage their strengths and confuse the enemy. The most common patterns are illustrated on the following pages. Mission briefings may specify particular deployment patterns in addition to the 6 provided here. Note that, unless otherwise specified, all players choose their own deployment pattern. So right away, we've got a couple things just to talk about. Once in a while, a mission briefing may say, hey, the defender is going to start with this particular pattern because it just makes sense for how the mission flows. But generally, we are not specifying deployment patterns when you roll up a mission. The only exceptions are usually when a defender needs to be near certain objectives, or in a narrative campaign, like if you're starting a mission after a drop, a subsequent chapter, then there's recommendations. But most of the time, if you're playing competitively, if you're doing one-off games, boom, you get to pick your deployment pattern. You get lots of tactical opportunities. So we start with pattern Starfall, deployment pattern Starfall, which is the traditional deployment pattern for Feet First into Hell. If it's not broke, don't fix it, right? So it's one of the most common patterns that you're probably going to continue to use because you're comfortable with it, but not the only one. So we don't need to linger here. If you're familiar with Feet First into Hell, you know how deployment pattern Starfall works. Let's take a look at the new ones. We've got pattern Thunder, which has a no man's land down the center. And when you pick pattern Thunder, you basically pick one long edge of the board to deploy from, and then you can deploy your enemies or your units up to 8 inches from the edge, so it gives you a wide band into which to drop, but you can't deploy them closer than 6 inches to an objective token. So bare minimum, it's probably going to take your units about 1 turn to get to objectives. That might be useful, or this might be useful for holding the line or just for containing where you're dropping your units. It really depends on your mission, but it is a highly flexible deployment pattern, and it's one of the ones that we've leaned on when we've played some competitive drops. Then we've got deployment pattern Talon. This is one of my favorites. Basically, you pick a point on an edge, and then you draw an 18-inch straight line off of that edge. You can choose the attitude of the line. Is it shallow? Does it go deep? It's really up to you, so it gives you a great degree of flexibility, but all of your units must then be deployed along that line, and you have to respect the drop scatter penalty. So the first round, you're very limited. You may only be able to deploy 3 units right off the bat. It makes you hold them in reserve. So there's an element of danger there. But because you can choose the attitude of the line and you can drop them very close to objectives, it can be a lot of fun to have deployment pattern Talon. So it's one that I like to use personally, just because you have a lot of flexibility with it. It is very vulnerable to railguns, though. If you know, you know. And then we've got deployment pattern Claw. Deployment pattern Claw basically is deployment pattern Starfall, but instead of having the drop scatter penalty keeping your units apart, it keeps them together. So while deploying into high danger zones sometimes requires tight groupings, while pattern Claw allows fire teams to assemble faster than pattern Starfall, it does reduce battlefield maneuverability because your units cannot be deployed more than 3 inches from one another. So they have to be very tight. If you have an enemy that's using area of effect damage, like grenades or rockets, you could be in for a bad time, but also this can be a real knuckle sandwich if the enemy is not prepared to deal with a bunch of units all at once. If you have low value, high unit clusters, you can deploy a lot of units using pattern Claw into a concentrated force very quickly. Then we've got 2 more, and then we'll wrap this video up. But we've got deployment pattern Bull, which I really like, but it is absolutely chaotic. Divides the board into 4 for you, and it's utilized only by the most reckless and desperate drop teams, but basically it guarantees close quarters combat. So if you choose pattern Bull, even if you win initiative, you have to deploy second, because every unit you lay down has to be minimum, or it has to be at the minimum distance allowed by the drop scatter penalty. So basically, I put a unit, you put a unit right on top of mine. You're guaranteed to have close quarter combat, but this can backfire, and I think it's very fun. But if you don't have strong units or you have not very many units, it can get out of hand really quickly. So it's neat. Pattern Bull really changes the name of the game because it's so aggressive, but maybe it's for you, maybe it's not. And then we have deployment pattern Cyclone, which is very synchronized. Deployment pattern Cyclone basically has you deploy 1 unit into each quadrant going clockwise. You can end up with more than 1 unit in a quadrant if you've gone all the way around the circle, but you don't have to. You can just end deployment here. And if you do end deployment, then you get initiative the next round, regardless of what the typical rules would say. So if I deploy 1, 2, 3, and the other player continues to deploy them, then I end up with initiative, and I can choose which quadrant to start the clock on the next time. So those are our 6 deployment patterns. Very different, some aggressive, some strategic, some more about territory control. It's really up to you which ones you want to use, but it adds another layer of tactical choice to the game that I think really distinguishes the 2025 version of Feet First into Hell as a more mature, developed, robust rule system from the original version, which it was slimmer. It was designed to be really slim, very fast to learn, but now we have more options without changing the core of the game. And then finally, just as another little preview of some of the graphical work that I'm doing, we have a model of the game board for players so that we can have some common vocabulary, make sure that everybody understands what terms mean. This is a beta graphic. I've got it working. It's got some lighting already, but I need to go in there and texture it so it looks a little nicer. But it just gives you an idea of the amount of work and effort that's gone into designing a bigger, better book. So that's it for this video. I want to keep it less than 10 minutes. If you're fired up about this new deployment pattern system, drop a like, drop a comment down below. Let me hear what you're looking forward to, and I'll be back next weekend with more preview stuff of the new version of Feet First into Hell for early 2025. All right, that's it. I'm LR Knight. This is Lionborn Publishing. Stay fierce.